Morning's reading is from John chapter 6, beginning at verse 41, and it's on page 1070 of the Church Bibles. At this, the Jews there began to grumble about him because he said, "I am the bread that came down from heaven." They said, "Is this not Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How can he now say, 'I came down from heaven'?" "Stop grumbling among yourselves," Jesus answered. "No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws them, and I will raise them up at the last day. It is written in the prophets, they will all be taught by God. Everyone who has heard the Father and learned from him comes to me. No one has seen the Father except the one who is from God. Only he has seen the Father. Very truly I tell you, the one who believes has eternal life. I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, yet they died. But here is the bread that comes down from heaven, which anyone may eat and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I'll give for the life of the world."
So as I mentioned to the children earlier, I'm at that stage where I do think I need to be a bit more healthy. In fact, I think I need to do a little bit more exercise. We all know exercise is good. We know it's got, excuse me, we know it's got many benefits, and a lot of us probably feel like we should do a bit more exercise. I really like doing exercise. I don't mind going for a run. I don't mind playing sport. If someone says you need to do more exercise, I think, oh, that's a great thing. My problem is, though, where do I fit it in? See, I've got a lot going on. I've got a life to lead. I've got a job. I've got family. I've got church. At the moment, we've got the Euros, right? So where am I going to fit it in? How do I manage it? Well, you know what? I might be good. Might be really good, and I might say, let's go on top of my diary. And I might think exercise is good for me, so if I put a slot in my diary, I can fit it in around everything else I'm doing. I don't need to change what I'm doing, I don't need to change my life, but I can just fit it in alongside what I'm doing if I'm good. Well, think about this picture with me for a moment. Think that there's a man who goes to the doctor. And the doctor looks at some test results and says, "It's not good. You're not in good shape. You are not well. You've not looked after yourself. Your blood pressure is through the roof. And I don't know how your heart can stand it. Let me put it bluntly, you need to exercise, otherwise you're going to die." And I don't just mean to choose the stairs over a lift. I mean, you need to work up to doing as much as you can, as hard as you can, straight away, and not just this week or this month, but for as long as you can. Otherwise, you're going to die. Well, what does that man do? Is he like me and says, "Well, I think I've got half an hour on a Saturday if I wake up in time"? No, that man is going to say, "No, I need this. I need to change the rest of my life. I need to orient everything else around exercise. I'll watch the Euros if it fits in, but exercise is the thing I really, really need to do, because if I don't do it, I will die." Well, in this passage, in fact, not just in this week's passage, the whole section we're looking at in John chapters 5 and 6, Jesus doesn't talk about exercise. Don't worry, I'm not going to tell you that Jesus tells you need to go out running. But Jesus doesn't talk about exercise, but he does talk about food. And food is just like exercise for that man in my picture. We need it, otherwise we're going to die. And Jesus says he is like food that you can't give up on, you can't take a break from. You're going to need this, otherwise you die. Now Jesus is talking to people who, they've got their own life going on. They've got stuff in their life they think is much more worthwhile than having Jesus. He's talking to some people who've got a lot of religious stuff going on. They think, "No, I'm doing fine." A lot of good works, a lot of respect from the people around them. They're doing fine, and Jesus comes along and says, "You're going to need me, otherwise you die." And they've got to work out what to do with Jesus. For anyone who seems to like Jesus, they might think he's a bit like exercise for me. I like him, but I can keep him on the side and fit him in where I can manage it. Where it doesn't affect too many other things, I can have a bit of Jesus in my life, and that'll be nice. I know it's good for me, so I should. And if I'm disciplined, I'll get half an hour a week, and that's great. But Jesus' claim is they need him like they need food. Without him, they'll die. His claim in this passage is that he's not someone who's going to fit into what you've got going on already. He's not here to help you do what you're already doing. He's like food. He's going to tell people that you need your life to revolve around him. And just like food, Jesus says you're not going to be able to keep him at arm's length. The kids start with the apple. You don't just have him and keep him in a box somewhere. You've got to consume him. Now, if that sounds strange, you've got no idea what's coming next week. Next week, it gets a lot more like this, so tune in next week, because we're going to look at a lot about what that means. But here's the first thing Jesus says about all this. He says, you're going to need less religion and more Jesus. Less religion and more Jesus. We're looking particularly up to, from verses 41 to 47. And in that first part of the passage, Jesus makes this point to the people who are listening. Whatever you think you're doing, morally or religiously, or whatever spiritual aspect there is in your life, if Jesus isn't part of it, then it's not from God. I knew someone once who went to work in another country doing cross-cultural work, and they were part of a team of other people from other countries, diverse countries. So it was an international team going out to somewhere in the world to do some work. But their first bit of work that they were doing was actually back in the UK. And so most of the team from other countries needed some cross-cultural training. And my friend was from Britain, and she attended the classes on how to stick to British customs. But she was British herself. And the person leading the training wasn't British. And they read it from a book. And she had to sit through this very strange training about how British people will be so offended if they invite you to their house and they offer you a cup of tea and you refuse. Now, some of you are from other countries. You might have been taught this. You might think, yes, that's true. But let me tell you, if you come to my house and you would not like tea, that's okay. I'm not offended. That's okay, I'll keep it for myself. That's fine, have what you want. She had to be taught that you have to eat everything with a knife and fork. In the UK, we use knife and fork, and you've seen that. And they said, look, you've got to eat with a knife and fork, and if you don't, oh, that's offensive. Oh, when you have that sandwich, when you have that packet of crisps, you've got to make sure you get that knife and fork out. And she's scratching her head thinking, no, people in Britain are not that bothered about how you eat a sandwich, actually. She was told, and maybe I've seen this a little more, that when in Britain what we do is when you meet someone, you have to ask how they are. And probably we do that. Are you okay? Okay. But it sounds like perhaps it was overdone a little bit, and they said you have to stop and you have to ask them how they're doing. Which came out as just you pass someone on the street and you say, hello, how are you doing? And to a British person, that sounds a little bit intrusive. It's a funny one, that one. Now, my friend was listening to all this and thinking, whatever you think you're learning, it's not true. Because it's not coming from someone who really knows what they're talking about. It's not coming from someone who's a British person. It's not coming from someone who's lived in the UK. And this part of the conversation in John chapter 6, from verses 41 to 47, Jesus is speaking to religious leaders. And they think they know it all because they've studied the scriptures. They know the scriptures deeply. They've discussed them. They've debated them. They've done a whole lot of thinking on what God is like and what we should do to please God and how he wants us to live. And along Jesus comes and he says, you know what God wants? He wants you to have the bread of life, and that is me. And they think, that's absurd. You just said you're bread that's come from heaven, but we know where you've come from because you're a local lad. You've come from Nazareth, and we know your mum and dad. They think Jesus is being absurd. You haven't come down from heaven, they say. You came from Nazareth, just down the street, from the house with the right roof. You didn't come from heaven. And Jesus says, yeah, you would think that if you've never been taught by someone from heaven. You would think that if you've never been taught by God, which is an alarming thing to say to the most high-up religious leaders in the country. Jesus is saying to them, you're a bit like the person doing the cross-cultural training. That I don't know what you think you know about God, but you've never actually learned from God, have you? Because the mark, Jesus says in verse 45, the mark of someone who's really learned from God, the mark of someone who's been listening to God, is that they come to Jesus. And not grumble about it, not send away, not say, we know where you're from. The mark of someone who's learned from God is to come to Jesus. And Jesus knows what he's talking about. Because verse 47, he says he's seen the Father, and he's come from him. And so we're talking to somebody who knows what God wants, and who knows what God's plan is, and who knows that God's plan is that you come to Jesus. And listen, this matters to us, because it means that whatever we think we're doing for God, whatever spiritual element there is in your life, whatever your religious life looks like, if Jesus isn't part of that, then that's not from God. Because the one from God has told us, specifically, God wants you to come to Jesus. So however religious, however good you are, however amazing you think your worship is, if it doesn't lead us to come to Jesus, it's false. Jesus says, everyone who's heard the Father and learned from him comes to me. So if you get a spiritual lift from singing worship songs, but you never actually have those moments where the songs really help your heart to come to Jesus, then whatever spiritual lift you're getting is not God's work in your life. If you love investigating Christianity, debating deep theological ideas, if you've been a Christian for a long time but you love to prove to others that Christianity is true against secularism, you stand for Christian values in the world, but if you do all of that and your heart has never been moved to personally come to and address Jesus Christ, then whatever learning you've got is not learning that's come from God. If you love church, if you're all about community and friendship and connection, you're here and this is something unique, but what we do at church never actually leads you to come in person to Jesus, then whatever you're feeling about church isn't God's leading in your life. Because what do people who've learned from the Father do? Verse 45. They come to Jesus. Who is it who has eternal life? Verse 47. It's the one who believes. These religious leaders, they've got theology and ceremony and rituals and good works coming out of their ears, but they've got no room for Jesus. And so, they're not listening to the only one who can tell them what God wants from them. And so Jesus says they might be religious, but they don't know God. Listen, the call here is don't be them. Don't be them. Less religion, more Jesus. We've also got this. Less help, more life. If you're in any sense feeling like you're not where you want to be spiritually, what do you think would give you the proverbial shot in the arm? What do you think would it take to get you really spiritually alive, on fire? Or what's the moment, what's the event, what kind of thing do you think would change you from being where you are now to being the person you think, yes, I'd be really on fire for God, I'd be passionate, I would be so joyful and deeply awed of God? What would that be? I often think that I would really grow spiritually if I saw an amazing work of God, some amazing gobsmacking miracle, a work of God in my life, or some sort of healing or revival in our city. And I guess that's the kind of thing I pray for his work in my life to happen magnificently. Provision for the things I need, so that I see God's great work, God's great power at work. Now Jesus makes a point in verse 49. He's actually stating the obvious in verse 49. It's amazing what he says in verse 49. It's so obvious and it's so profound. ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, and yet they died. Here's what he's referring to. The forefathers of the Jewish people were a clan travelling in the wilderness where there was no food. And God did an amazing work of miraculous power to keep them alive, to sustain them. He showed his power to them. He gave them bread from heaven every day to keep them alive during years and years of wandering. They saw an amazing first-hand act. They saw firsthand an amazing act of God, and they saw it every day. That's what this picture's about. I think someone took a photo at the time of how they were responding. Can you imagine seeing God do a miracle like this? A miracle that keeps an entire nation alive? A miraculous work of God, and it happens every single day for the rest of your life. Do you think that would encourage you spiritually? Do you think that would give you a boost, a lift, something that would draw you close to God? That would increase your faith, right? That would make you on fire for God. And Jesus says, the Israelites had that bread, and still they died. If you were to read the story of them, they didn't just die physically, they ignored God. They were faithless. They abandoned God. Because Jesus is pointing out that more important than an amazing act of God's power and provision, more important to your faith and your growth and your perseverance than even seeing an amazing miracle of God, more important is that you come to Him. Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, yet they died. In other words, what good is that? To see God powerfully at work if it just stops there. But, verse 15, but here is bread that comes down from heaven, which anyone may eat and not die. As I reflected on this week, I realised that I think I'm more obsessed with manna than I am with Jesus. What characterises my prayers more, and actually this is because it's revealing what's in my heart, is me asking Jesus for manna-type things. Lord, would you intervene in my life to provide this for me tomorrow? Lord, would you help me do my thing? Rather than me asking for Him. But what I need is you. What I need is something other than what I need to carry on doing what I'm doing. What I need is you. Something different. Do you find that's the same for you? I pray and I ask God for a good night's rest. I ask Him for success in the thing I'm about to do. I ask Him for healing for something that's wrong with me. I ask Him for patience, because I know something's going on in my life. I ask Him for opportunities. I ask Him for courage. I ask Him for manna, so that I can do my thing tomorrow and the next day. Now, it's okay to depend on God. If you ask for those things, that's not wrong. But if that's what you think Jesus is all about, providing you with the thing that you're going to need next, well, you're forgetting that God did provide His people with all the things that they needed next. And they walked away faithless. They died in the wilderness. It did them no good. Because what God sends from heaven, Jesus says, is what you most need. It's Jesus. See, I can fit Jesus in around my own life. And I've no doubt that when I pray, I see God's amazing provision in my life. But that's not what gets me anywhere spiritually. The ancient Israelites, they knew God providing, but they were unfaithful and died disobedient. Jesus says He offers something better. He says He's not here to help you out, but to offer Himself as the bread that keeps you persevering in faith. Bread that keeps you trusting, hoping, keeps you holding on to God's promises. This is what will make the difference. This is what encourages you. This is what puts your heart on fire for the Lord, is Jesus. Do you want manna more than you want Jesus? Do you want provision, help, more than you want life with Jesus and hope beyond death? Now, you might find that a challenging question, but here's how to deal with it. Jesus here, if you read this carefully, He's not telling you off. Jesus isn't saying, that's the question, so what's your priority? He's not telling anyone off. He comes to those who experience God's good gifts, but are still wondering where the deep joy is, where the hope is. And he offers you exactly what you need. He's not telling you off, he's offering you. He's offering you himself. He loves to give you satisfaction and joy and hope. He wants you to have it. He's less about giving help, more about giving life. Less help, more life. Before I go on to the third point, an illustration. Imagine you are going to extend your house, and you can put in a room in your house that is for anything you want. A specific room for something. You might have seen pictures of celebrity houses, and they've got a room off their bedroom, and that room is for all their clothes. They've got clothes on one wall and shoes on another. Don't know if you would like that in your dream house, a room especially for clothes. Or maybe you've seen someone's house and they've got a room in their house especially for exercise. They've got a gym in there, a home gym. What would you want in your house? A room especially for something that you want. Would you want a home cinema? Here's what I would quite like. I'd quite like a home recording studio, put all my instruments in there rather than have kids' toys and instruments in the same place. I'd love to be able to close the door and get playing and get composing, get recording. What would you have in the room in your house that's especially dedicated for something? Well, we all actually do have a room in our house that's dedicated for something we think is important. We do actually have something in our life that we think is so important, you've got to have a room in your house for it. In fact, there's something so important in our lives that we not only dedicate an entire room in our house to it, but we schedule our days around it. Our employers give us time off for it. Our birthday celebrations revolve around it. And we all have that same something in our life that if we didn't have it, we would die. I'm talking about this room, the kitchen. We all have a dedicated room to food. Because food's not like exercise. We don't have the option of fitting food into our life around the edges and hoping that it doesn't affect the rest of life. My house has a room dedicated to storing and preparing food. Our employers give us half an hour in the middle of the day to stop working so that you can have food. The biggest shop I've been to this week is a shop called Asda. And it's an acre dedicated to keeping food at the centre of my life. Why? Well, because if I didn't have food, I'd die. I'm hungry for it. I'm desperate for it. I need it so badly that I will have an entire acre of a shop to give it to me, and I'll give it a whole room in my house. I need food, otherwise I will die. So when Jesus calls himself the bread of life, he is making sure that we don't have the option to fit him into our carefully diarised lives. Jesus says he's the bread of life. He is something that our lives depend on. And so thirdly, we're called to less fasting and more eating. Let's have a little look at particularly verse 50 and 51. Let me read it out. But here is the bread that comes down from heaven, which anyone may eat and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. Did you watch any of the election coverage this week? I only watched a little bit, but I was fortunate enough to the little bit that I did watch. I was able to watch live one of the moments that's the highlight of the entire election evening. I watched this bit. I hope you've seen it. I hope some of you have seen it. It's a bit where the Labour MP, Wes Streeting, he unwittingly overcommits to a metaphor about ships. And starts to talk about ships, and he sort of kind of can't back out of it. Here's what he says. Yes, the implosion of the Conservative Party and the SNP has put wind in Labour's sails. Good. But the only reason we have sails on the ship, and the ship is ship shape, is because Keir Starmer took the vessel from a shipwreck in 2019 and made it ship shape and seaworthy. Someone thought that maybe he'd been paid £10 every time he could get the word ship shape into a conversation. It's a bit cringy, and if you saw it, you'll know what I mean. He certainly stretched the metaphor as far as it would go. He's talking about ships. And he wants to say the next thing about ships and the next thing about ships. And I don't know if you feel that Jesus drives himself down the cul-de-sac of a metaphor in these verses here. He says, I'm the bread. Okay, good, yes, thanks Jesus, you're the bread. You're like manna, right? He's like manna. He comes from heaven and he sustains us. So that bread. He says, I'm the bread, and you think, well, bread is central to our lives, and Jesus should be central to our lives. Great. But then you might kind of read this and think he's stuck with how to land the metaphor. Doing a bit of a West Streeting, that MP. Where do you take this metaphor? Well, what do you get? What do you have to do with bread to get the benefits? That's what you have to do with Jesus. You have to eat the bread to get the benefits. So Jesus then says you've got to eat Jesus. Oh, maybe he stretched this too far. So he says, whoever eats this bread will live forever. What does he mean? Is he stretching that metaphor? And then he explains the metaphor. Let me decode it for you. The bread is my flesh. Oh, hang on. That's an uncomfortable way to land this metaphor. You've got to eat his flesh. Now, I would try and explain this. I'd love to say to you, here's how it works. I'd love to put you all at ease. But if you're to read on, Jesus doesn't back away. He doesn't back down from this. He goes right in. And I take it that that's because there's something more uncomfortable and more arresting about Jesus than we think. We saw in the first point that any religion or spiritual living without Jesus isn't from God. So it's great to have Jesus near. But more than that, though, we've seen that Jesus isn't just someone to have near. It's like a genie who will answer our personal requests. It's got to be closer than that. And so Jesus takes it even further, even deeper, and says, not only do you have to have me, not only do you have to not have me at the edges, but have me central. He says, you've got to have me like you have bread. He offers himself as bread in a physical and visceral way. Like food, he says, you need me inside you, becoming part of you. We need our constant heartbeat and lifeblood to come from Jesus, and our lives depend on it. We need him to be physical, flesh, and we need him to have given up his flesh. Otherwise, we starve. We die if Jesus isn't the bread that we eat. It can become complicated, so just let me say, if you get confused, think about the kids' talk. I think that might have explained it. Hopefully you'll get much out of the rest of this, but think about the kids' talk. That's what I mean. But let's think about the Israelites that Jesus talked about, the wilderness Israelites. They had outer bread from God, satisfied their needs, and yet they could still walk away from God. Because without Jesus as the bread of life, you've got day-to-day material sustenance from God. You might have had good bread from God and your family, your friends, your job, your home. They're good gifts, but you know, don't you, deep down, that good gifts from God is not enough. You need a deeper security in your life than a spouse and a job. You need deeper joy than friends and good times. You need something more than bread that fills your stomach. Because what happens when your friends fail to satisfy? What happens when the good times dry up? What happens when you've got all you could possibly want, and inside you are deeply sad and empty? And what happens when you have all you could possibly want and you lose it? What happens to your hope when you get sick? What's your life going to be when you retire and you've not got long left? What can you say when a loved one suddenly dies and you have grief that never goes away for the rest of your life? Where are you going to be when you get to the end of your life? The legacy you leave behind, the fact you'll be forgotten within 30, 50 years. What kind of hope and confidence do you have? What kind of provision from God do you need? What are you starving for? And then you die. What confidence can you have when you've died that you've done enough to please God? What can you say before God when he examines your life and exposes your lies? What excuse have you got when your selfishness all comes out before God on his judgment seat? You need something. We are desperate and hungry for something that satisfies that. And what about when God says, your sin deserves hell? What have you got? We all need Jesus. Without him, we die. We're in deep, deep need. We've got nothing to satisfy in life. We've got no hope in death. We need Jesus. And we need him close. We need him with us, and we need him in us. We can't just hold on to Jesus. We need to consume him. Like food, you don't just take and think, I've got to. You take it in you. We desperately need what he gives, otherwise we starve. Otherwise we die. But there's something really lovely, really wonderful that keeps jumping out as we go through these really tricky passages in John 6. Whatever Jesus says that confronts you, whatever Jesus says that is challenging, let me point out that this is also loudly an invitation. Jesus is not speaking here to put down someone who's far away from him, someone who is missing the deep joy of Jesus, someone whose religious life is all over the shop. He's not out to put you down. We've skipped a couple of verses. In verse 45, he quotes from Isaiah, where Isaiah says they will all be taught by God. And what he means is that anybody is eligible to learn from God that Jesus is for you. There's an offer. Jesus says the Father's plan all along was that everyone will be taught by God that Jesus is for you. You can have him. You can have that satisfaction. You can have what you so desperately need. Maybe you're just not starving enough. Maybe you're just not hungry for him. But he's there, and he's for you. That amazing experience of eating God-given manna in the wilderness sounded great, but it was only for a set, exclusive group of people in one generation. But Jesus says in verse 50, anyone can have Jesus. The manna wasn't actually for you. You'd have died anyway. But Jesus is for you, and he says in verse 50, I want anyone to have me. It's an invitation. And he offers himself in verse 51 to whoever. We are starving for Jesus. And Jesus gives himself to us unconditionally and freely. And this passage is an offer of Jesus because he's given himself for us. He mentions it at the end of verse 51. The flesh he gives for the life of the world. He does it when he dies on the cross, willingly. See, our hopelessness, our need, our starvingness, the fact we have no hope and nothing except guilt and sin, that is all placed on Jesus' flesh as a physical human. He bears our sin and our unworthiness before God. He gives his flesh for that purpose, so it can bear our sin and guilt. And it is punished. His flesh is punished. His flesh is killed. And in that moment, as Jesus dies on the cross, our guilt is gone. And our hopelessness disappears. And hope fills us. It's ours if we take it. But you don't just take food. You take it in. See, what Jesus has done in giving his flesh for the life of the world, we don't just smile and nod at. We don't just accept it and say, oh, I believe that. Oh, I believe that apples are good for me. Nod. Yeah, I'm on board with that. Jesus is saying here that nodding is not really the response he's after. He's given his flesh for you. He wants you to take it and accept it deeply as something you're starving for. Your hope, your only hope. If this is all hard to get your head around, let me try and strip it back as we come to the end. We can't fully see how deeply starving and hopeless we are in life and death. But if God would open our eyes, we would see all the more brightly and gloriously the joy and relief that Jesus is ours. His life is ours in place of our death. And the more we get into the magnitude of that, the less Jesus becomes someone we just want to fit into our lives. And the more he becomes our all in all. The more he becomes our food we are desperate for. And him being bread makes perfect sense. We die without him. This isn't the kind of passage that ends with a tidy application. Often people like that about sermons. Go and do this. 3 little steps to take away. Well, we don't have that. But there is a clear response. Jesus offers himself to you. personally, come to him. Come to him in your vulnerability. Come to him in your sin. Come to him in your sadness. He is yours. He invites you to accept him deeply as what you are starving for.